Welcome to the Book Bungalow. This is our virtual author event with David Elsensohn, one of the winning authors, published in L. Ron Hubbard Presents Writers of the Future, Volume 36. We're also joined today, or we will be joined, I hope, before too long, by David Farland, also known as David Wolverton. He's the well-known fantasy author, and he edited this book. My name is Tanya Mills. I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah. We're Southern Utah's only independent bookstore, offering all new books in a full range of events. While we're open and taking precautions, we're doing our events virtually for now. Writers of the Future, Volume 36, as well as other books related to today's presentation, is available for order from our store's website, and I'm going to be posting the links in the chat box. The first link will be for the book itself. The second link will be it will include that book, but also a couple of former editions and a few of Dave Wolverton's books, or Dave Farland's books, and as well as a link to David Elsensohn's, I hope I'm saying your name right, Elsensohn or Elsensohn?
Perfectly well, thank you.
Okay, his website. And I will be sure to include all three links in the recording that's posted to YouTube as soon as the video posts on our channel there. And if you want a signed book plate, signed by both Davids, hopefully, please add a note about that when you order through our website. It will be mailed to you separately. As many of you may already know, Writers of the Future is a science fiction and fantasy story contest established by L. Ron Hubbard in the 80s. A sister contest, Illustrators of the Future, presents awards for science fiction art. There's no entry fee, and it's the highest paying contest for amateur science fiction and fantasy writers. Besides Dave Wolverton himself, notable winners in the past have included Stephen Baxter, Karen Joy Fowler, James Allen Gardner, Nina Kariki Hoffman, Dean Wesley Smith, and others. I believe we have some of David Elson's, we may even have some of your fellow winners here on the call today. The 12 winning stories each year are paired with 12 winning illustrators and published in an annual anthology. And if you're not familiar, the illustrations are near the beginning in color, in full color, and I'm showing you, this is the one that was paired with David's story, Trading Ghosts. And his illustrator, before I introduce both David and hopefully, oh, somebody else is in, but it's not David yet. Before I introduce David, I wanted to point out that Mohammed Hossein Matak, known by his American friends as Mason, was the winning illustrator paired with his story. He was born and lives in Iran, so he couldn't be on this call. But if you'll bear with me for a second, I wanted to share my screen and so you could see a little bit of his work, and then we'll go on. So let me make sure I can do this. Hold on. Can you hear that? Okay, let's go back to, all right. Okay. Do I have, let me bring up participants again, see if David's made it in. No, okay, we're gonna go ahead. Our winning writer today, David Elsensohn, lives for coaxing language into pleasing arrangements. He's typically inspired by such language coaxers as Tolkien, Howard, Lieber, Norton, and Gaiman, or by well-crafted batches of single malt whiskey. He makes rather good sandwiches, he's told, and his chili recipe gets appreciative nods from friends. Most of his story ideas come from midnight scribblings on pads kept above his headboard, which occasionally results in appearances in various anthologies or online publications. He's currently laboring through several novels in the hopes that one of them will complete itself. Has that happened yet?
The hopes continue, yeah.
Okay.
Novels sluggishly.
Okay. Terminally distracted, he lives in Los Angeles with an inspirational wife and the ghost. You love ghosts. The ghost of a curmudgeonly black cat. Okay. We're extremely pleased to have him, and if David Farland ever shows up, I'll bring him in. But we're glad to have you with us today. And if any of you in the audience have any questions you'd like to pose during this recording, please ask them in the chat room and I'll do my best to raise them. Before I delve into my questions, I wanted to give all of you a chance to hear the author reading some of his own words. So just to set it up, in the story Trading Ghosts, we have a guilt-ridden cargo captain on a remote mining colony and a fallen angel who wants nothing more than to die. Please go ahead, David.
Thank you. Trading Ghosts.
And speak up louder.
Will do. I shouldn't drink. There is a squeeze in my chest that won't leave. Nothing ever reads wrong on the imagers. It has left me slow to move, reluctant to act, a manacle that rusts inside my rib cage. I hate it and myself. And if I could be rid of the pain, I would, though I could never lose the memory, nor should I. I deserve it. So I maintain my status as drunkard in a diner called the Ninth Novena, outside the mining colony I work for, on the oldest outpost of Gleef B. The diner stands aloof by the banks of Thruway 6, one of 8 mighty roads the color of powdered iron. Down these arteries thunder hectometer-long magna trucks laden with ore, wavering in the dusty heat. Our primary star, contemplating its imminent expansion into a red giant, sends its beams straining through a blood-flecked sky to pierce the diner's dirty windows. The light slices the air into crepuscular stripes, intercepted by dust motes in the glow of LEDs. Sister Jessamine runs the joint, wiping the counter in full habit. She's the missionary prime for this octant. She has a patient ear and a firm tone, and Björktai the bouncer, he of the 20 knuckles, when those fail. Sister Jess takes care of the girls and boys who work in the kitchen and who dance on the countertops for entertainment and sit on laps and sell conversation or intimacy. She doesn't let ghosts into the place, so they cluster outside, murmuring in the hazy daylight. Gleef B is overrun with ghosts, more ghosts than all the sentient beings who have ever lived here. It's like an ethereal dumping ground, a spirit's orphanage. Sometimes they're human. They take form, clustering in your periphery where it's hard to focus on them. Maybe ghosts are a species who died out millions of years ago. Maybe they're remnants of past divine creations that ran their cycle. Personally, I think they get swept into the accretion disk when planets form, crunched down into rock and fluid until they seep with their way upward to envy the living. Maybe the unlucky ones become our souls. I think about these things when I get deep enough in the bottle to see through its bottom and my heart is at its tightest. I empty my glass and sit patiently for Sister Jessamine's attentions. I glance around. An angel sits at the counter, a fallen one. He has been forgotten by God, allowed to slide off his plane of attention. I can't easily explain how we know they're angels. They're paragons of physical perfection, sure, but you can purchase that sort of thing on the main worlds. It's something about the eyes, the aura, the vibrations our skin detects. You can almost see the wings folded into themselves, hidden away in some fractal dimension. The old scriptures only mentioned wings for certain creatures. I hear the Islamic planets are visited by brilliant beings who are almost translucent and never sit or bend except in graceful, worshipful prostration. They are never fallen like ours. I'm not saying angels are saucer-dwelling aliens or that we were invented by ancient space-faring humans or some other anthropocentric pipe dream, just that divine beings turned out to exist. Theirs is not a science we understand yet, but they move among the stars. And our first little water-soaked ellipsoid isn't the first one they know about. People were conflicted when we first discovered their presence. Galactic exploration received a giant economic boost from the unexpected source of our homeworld's religious institutions. We tore some sheets from our scriptures when we found other civilizations and when the ghosts found us, but no one has ever answered our questions about what happens after we die. So we still chew on a vague dissatisfaction. We still have no idea whether there is an afterlife. The angels aren't saying, and the ghosts don't say much at all. Despite this, or because of this, we still have religion down here on the planets and moons we move to. As an intelligent species, we land on worlds and colonize them, inserting ourselves into their exoticism, but we live with an eternal dépaysement, hence the religion, afterlife. We can only believe in something we haven't visited yet. The angel has been here every day for a week, emitting sadness like a beacon. He speaks to no one, ignoring the girls and boys who clamor for his attention. I have no idea where he goes at night unless Jessamine locks up the place with him in it. I look at her, nodding towards him. Her brown face carefully neutral, she upends a bottle over my glass and drops in a rare ice stick with a pair of tongs. I know what he is, Ambrose, she murmurs. But how can you counsel an angel? How do you pray for one? No idea. I guess you just do. Pray on someone else's behalf. Isn't that the process? Is that enough? Or I'm afraid you're muted.
You're right, I muted myself for a minute. That included the part I was going to ask you about too, so that's perfect. Okay. First, I loved your story, as I told you in my email. Not only was it well written, it was, I think, very thought-provoking and even moving at the end. Before I get into specific questions about the story, I noticed from your website you write a lot of fantasy, and yet Trading Ghosts is science fiction. Have you written other science fiction, and what are you most drawn to? Science fiction or fantasy, and why?
I write fantasy, science fiction, and horror. I'm surprised by the amount of horror stories I end up writing. I do have another short story that I did submit to Writers of the Future, which I was fortunate to get an honorable mention on, and I'd like to resubmit it somewhere, but it ended up getting published in one of those online magazines that ended up being an HTML file on a Smashword site. So it's technically published, but it's wasting away in some corner of the internet. So it's tough to send it out again. And the current novel I'm working on is post-apocalyptic science fiction, so which is also exploring questions that we might ask about what happens after the apocalypse to those of us who are left behind. As to which one I'm drawn to reading fantasy more, but I do read both. And I realized that once I discovered that we would be speaking today with David Farland, that I'm afraid I don't have any of his books in my collection, so I need to remedy that.
Okay. Which is the more difficult for you to write?
They're both for different reasons. With science fiction, I'm compelled to do a lot of research because you want to get the science right.
Right.
For some kind of faster than light travel, we can hand wave that a little bit and say that, yes, we got here to the planet. But for other things, you don't want to screw up existing physics and laws of things that savvy readers will point at and say that's not how it works. So the writing of science fiction for me goes more slowly because I want to make sure that everything's correct. And I also feel like when I write something in science fiction, I'm tackling a subject. Like with my other story, it's about humans becoming transhuman, evolving away into something more so they can explore other planets and wearing nanotech level suits to protect them. And so, of course, I did a bunch of research on that kind of thing. And now that I've done that, I don't think I would be telling more stories in that vein. For fantasy, it's difficult because I'm torn between the normal tone that I take with fantasy, which is sort of a lofty, high fantasy type of thing, versus a more modern sensibility. I don't write gritty the modern gritty fantasy that's very popular very well, and I don't think I can get that modern sounding with it. It still has to sound a little bit archaic when I write it, I think. But I have a world for that. A fantasy novel that I have completed that I'll hopefully might get published someday, and a world that I have to tell stories in. So I'll keep writing in that vein. Probably a lot of short stories.
Okay, great. Now, in your story, Trading Ghosts, we have a human with an uncomfortable past, a fallen angel, a nun of sorts, and ghosts that always seem to be hovering about. So what I found fascinating was that you would mix science fiction, which is based on science, or the observable world, whether it's a world we're in or a world you create in the future, with religion, which is based so much on faith and what you cannot see. What gave you the idea to do this? To bring them both? I don't think I am not the world's biggest science fiction reader, but I hadn't come across that before.
The story itself came from something I scribbled on that notepad. That was just one line. It just says, "This is gone. She kills angels." And I had no idea where it was going to go from that. And then I started putting this together. I think it's because I've always been fond of like looking in the areas that's not written in scripture, or at least not discussed much. A lot of those questions, not necessarily contradictions as some people might argue, but more like, well, what happens about this part that isn't talked about? And as we do become more advanced and start exploring more of the universe, I don't think there's necessarily a conflict between the two. I myself am not I don't adhere to any particular faith at all. Like a little bit spiritualist here, but more tolerant, I think. But there's no dogmas or set religions that I follow. Like if we discovered through some kind of evidence that humans can survive after death in some sort of ghostly manner, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. I'm not put out by that. But the mixture of it, I think it just felt natural to do so. And this story really doesn't address those questions. It sort of makes the point of saying that we've discovered divine beings And we still have a lot of things up in the air that we are forced to rely on faith for if we want to.
Yeah. Are you going to be doing other stories along that vein? Exploring that?
If they occur to me, if there's something that seems like a story to be told in that sense, the ghosts tend to pop up a lot. I think it's because I took some international writing class once, and there was a South American author who had ghosts in his story, and they were just there in sort of a magical realism kind of way. And I'm afraid I don't recall the author right now, but people interacted with them, but there weren't any questions asked about them, and I liked that. And so being a writer, I ripped it off, of course. And they do show up in another story. As I mentioned, when I write science fiction, I sort of tackle one thing and then I sort of don't do it anymore. I have not a steampunk story, but it's sort of a Victorian Empire in space type of thing. And there are ghosts of that same vein on the moon that they're on, where they're just sort of present, but they don't interfere. They're just almost as if they're like a sounding board for human emotion. And I think that's why they're there.
Okay, well, it made sense to me because when you think about it, I think science and religion are both ways that we have to make sense of the world or to seek truth, but they come about it from different ways, different ends. They both try to answer the big questions, and you pose those questions in your thing. You know, what's the purpose of man, and where did human life begin, and what's going to happen after death, and those kinds of things. So I just found it fascinating. In the story, and you read this part, the main character Ambrose is ruminating about angels, and he notes in speaking about heavenly beings that theirs is not a science we understand yet. Does that represent your view that religion, that God and such is just, they work on a higher level of science? Or is that just something that you kind of came up with for the story?
Before I think on that, I realize I'd sort of been as careful as possible never to mention what sex Ambrose is. And I tried to write it from both points of view. And I find that overwhelmingly he's seen as male, you know, and I do it too. I just say he's seen as male. And I keep thinking just his, you know, it's there and them for Ambrose, and try to read it from either point of view. And then I think Mason saw that as well. And so the illustration comes out with a male protagonist in the illustration. And I'm okay with that. I think it sort of captures Ambrose's melancholy. But I just, and maybe it's because I picked the name Ambrose, which can be a man's name, or maybe it does, you know, of course I am perforce, I have to come from a white male point of view, but I was trying to write it as flexibly as I could. But in answer to the question, not really. I don't want to convey that I think that anything divine is mundane and it's just sciencey and we just don't know the sciencey bit yet. But I do think that if there is a divine presence, and the divine presence has gone to all this trouble to put together all these laws of physics in the universe that work, why would they force themselves to operate outside those parameters? Why not use those laws to be and to do? So I guess, so I suppose it's also, I've forgotten whose famous phrase it was, that sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic, but it does tap into, once we get to understand it and we can start making hypotheses and use the scientific method to measure and create theories on it, maybe, that we understand it. And then at that point we call it science. But I don't think it's, if there's anything like that, it's mundane. But if there's anything that is a miracle or anything like that, which is by definition outside of science and can't be defined or explained or
It can't be explained or defined by the known
Test it,
terms.
right? I couldn't say, but it doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily make that claim.
Okay, okay. So did you take physics classes to understand these kinds of things? You tend to do a lot
No,
of research.
I took remarkably few, I took far fewer science and math classes than I should have. And I would like to go back to school again to sort of absorb a little more of that knowledge. Um, but I did involve myself in a lot of theological debate, I guess, and logical fallacies and that kind of thing. And then when I'm writing, of course, I end up going down a rabbit hole of research, and then of course end up not writing anything because I'm busy learning and diving into articles and having fun with that.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Now, did you submit this same story the year before?
The one that was submitted before got an honorable mention, and it did change. They do ask that if you can resubmit every quarter if you haven't gotten anywhere with it yet. But if, I imagine that it's generally looked upon more favorably if you do work on the story a little bit. I have and I believe is in attendance, one of the people in a writing critique group I'm in, I have to thank for this, is that when he read my first incarnation of the story, it began with the whole premise of angels live in our universe. And then I sort of went into a bunch of backstory on that. And you don't really meet Ambrose until the second page. And he suggested move Ambrose's pain and his story to the very beginning. See, I said his again. So that we can get to know, so that we can immediately become connected with the protagonist. And I did so. I thought it was a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
So thank you, Carl. Much appreciated. And then I got the good news once I had submitted at that time after having worked on it and moving all the personal information to the beginning.
So that was but it was essentially that story that got the honorable mention, or different story entirely.
It is the same. It is Trading Ghosts, but
It's Trading Ghosts,
for brief, but shuffled.
but you made some changes. Yeah. Okay. I just.
And I'll never know whether it was because of that or because of different levels of competition. I don't want to think in those terms. I think because all the entries I see are of tremendous quality from all these writers.
Okay, my last question has got several parts, so it may take up some time. And go. You mentioned these different writers that you are inspired by, these the way they coax language, and I wanted to look at each one in particular and what strengths you get from that particular writer, or how they attract you. Let's see. And we'll start with the big one, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Never heard of him. No, Tolkien's Tolkien. As I remain a large Dungeons and Dragons enthusiast, any author that creates an entire world with a history and a mythology and languages and songs in it to populate it makes it that much more immersive. And he helped kick off that entire modern fantasy Western European point of view, with all the classic races and everything like that. And it threads itself through a lot of my fantasy too, at least sort of the roots of it. But yeah, what is there to say about Tolkien?
What do you think comes closest to Tolkien nowadays?
It would be harder for me to say because I am not as up on the newest works, because I've sort of been into reading a lot of classic fantasy and sci-fi from like the 70s and 80s. So I've been picking up and reading a lot of the things that I hadn't. And so who there is now that has that high fantasy feel, I don't know. I will say though that I have been reading a lot more works by Black authors, especially Black women. So I love Dr. Okorafor's work and N.K. Jemisin. And with reading all of those, coming from that background of when I'm growing up, all white dudes that I'm reading. And so, of course, I loved all those books and was not as aware of all these other points of view, which are so much richer. And so I want my writing to be, I want to capture a lot of that fantasy flavor, but still be able to write and view it through a feminist lens or a post-colonial lens or queer theory or anything, critical theory type of thing to consider it, to sort of make it less from a flat white male point of view, which leads me to Howard. Robert E. Howard is, despite occasional problematic viewpoints from the 1930s, he's an amazing storyteller. The language is raw and crisp and flowing, and it's heart-pumping stuff. And so I want to convey all of that in my writing if I can, in action scenes and so forth, while at the same time trying to be aware and as diverse and inclusive as possible. And with all of these authors, I'm talking about they're for fantasy. And I didn't mention Ursula K. Le Guin because she's, and I should have, and I intend to probably update the website to say so. I'd read The Left Hand of Darkness when I was a kid, and I didn't really understand it. And then I read it as an adult, and it, of course, blew my mind because she took this, what we all thought would be a very solid human state, is the duality of sex, and she completely tore that apart in a very elegant way and made it a non-issue. And of course, the Earthsea books, which, so yes, I definitely need to add her in the fantasy list. Those were a great point of view as well, because when I read that she was very sort of put out by and didn't subscribe to the idea of violence as a conflict, so that, you see a movie, there's a bad guy, the bad guy dies at the end. You have to defeat the bad guy, or you have to physically fight your way through. And of course, all my fantasy has that sort of thing. And when I read that, I'm sort of wondering if I'm doing it wrong, because she wrote that entire series where the point was not physical conflict, but conflict itself, difficulties and obstacles that a protagonist has to get past. And so another thing to keep in mind while I'm writing. I liked Norton because early on that was a newer point of view for me about women as protagonists, like the Witch World series. And Tanith Lee, same thing, just it's the authorial point of view adds things that I didn't realize could come through in the writing.
So have you written some stories with women as the protagonist?
The Victorian Empire in Space one has a woman as a protagonist, and my critique group seemed to like it, so hopefully I can get that out there. And I tried and it is sort of a commentary on male oppression in a way as well, with the difficulties that she has to face.
Yeah. And then the last, I think, was Neil Gaiman.
He flavors a lot of my style. I stopped writing like him about 15 years ago, but it really was a very deep influence for me, that detached, dreamy, lots of commas, but very poignant way of expressing things, and with a nod towards a tolerance of all mythologies. But yeah, I really appreciated his work.
Carl in the group, this must be the same one who you thanked, right?
Indeed.
He said, I've asked you this before, but I think it'd be interesting for the group here to read your answer. Did you have contact with the artist, and how do you feel he represented your book?
I've only exchanged a couple words with him. He did send a video of himself speaking and greeting everybody and saying hello to all the winners and everything. I'm afraid I haven't talked to him face to face. We were meant to. So no, I don't unfortunately have contact with him, but I would like to know him. I think he captured, as I mentioned, the melancholy of the work. Let me see if I can dig it up as well. There's a lot of dust and beige and a sense of loss, maybe. Right. And he said in the video that he was sort of surprised at first that the angel was male, because he says, where I come from, they're beautiful women. And I don't know how tongue in cheek he meant that, but it does mean apparently I have to study a little more about Islamic angels maybe. But he had a lot of fun doing it. And yeah, I think there's a sense of loss in it that I greatly appreciate.
Okay, first let me announce that David Farland's been trying to get into the event for 50 minutes without success. He apologizes, but is having technical difficulties. He'll be glad to autograph any books purchased from this event, and they can be purchased through the Book Bungalow. And I put the link up at the top. If you'll scroll up, I'm going to try and copy it again. Anyway, Cormac said, I was wondering if you could talk about your process for the benefit of those of us who may have started and stopped things a million times.
And I also noticed he said the shout out to Fritz Leiber,
Oh, yeah.
which influenced me because Leiber and Michael Moorcock have such a wizardry with their writing. I mean, they will put a phrase down that is so thick with metaphor and so purple, and I will read it and go, damn it, I did not write that. And I wish I did. This assumes I have a successful process. I have a pile of things. I'm sorry?
He said, specifically, I was wondering if you could speak to any habits you have about setting and sticking to a schedule or any other rituals you have to get things done. So go on with what you were saying and then.
I'm a terrible procrastinator, and so no, any advice I have to give about process and discipline and ritual and that sort of thing can be completely thrown out the window because I don't have those things. I want to follow all the good advice. You must write every day to be a writer. Write even when you don't feel like it. Don't wait for inspiration to strike, etc. I have books above my bed, little piles of notebooks that at 3 a.m. I'll jot down an idea, and then eventually it'll make it into a digital note file, and then maybe a story will come out of it, or it'll get injected into a story. But I don't, unfortunately, just being overwhelmed with work and life and,
So when do you write? When do you write?
Almost always late at night.
Late at night.
Right. After a full work day where I've been on the computer all day. And so I have to decide how inspired do I feel to sit in front of the computer some more and switch gears from code development to writing. And I also tend to write very linearly in that I'll never skip ahead and write a scene that I know what happens in it. If I reach a point where I'm slowing down because I'm not really clear on what's happening here, or I'm not sure how to get through the scene, I'll be stuck until I snowplow through it. And maybe that's a drawback that I have, but it does mean that certain works will get stalled, or ideas that won't be fleshed out, or because I haven't come up with the plot for the dang thing. But for me, it's usually when something clicks with the story that allows the story to be completed. So, I should have a process. I should have a point where I stop and say, I'm going to write, and I'm going to write this many 100 words, or write for an hour or something. Open up a document and get going.
And that might be easier with Are you working mostly on novels now? Or are you still doing short stories?
I want to get back out there in the markets with the short stories. I have a couple of them that I want to start sending out. And I also want to keep writing short stories, but then I stopped for a while, and then my published work page had a dearth of a year or two because I was working on 2 novels, one of which was the post-apocalyptic one, and the other one is a fantasy one. And I'm just sort of slogging through those side by side. And that's mostly the document I'll open up at the end of the day and start working on.
Okay, Bobby Johnston wants to know, she said, or he, in line with conversation about the intersection of science and religion in David's story, I liked how he solved the problem of time travel, or speeding up space and time, by the angel being able to accomplish this and to transfer this ability to the protagonist by being a spiritual being without the limitations of a physical presence. It seems authors would often first go to science rather than spirituality to solve this problem. I wonder if he could speak to this aspect of the story. I think it was brilliant.
Thank you, Bobby. There in the story, there is like a note about that, about Ambrose's expectations that, okay, we're going to have to charter a ship, we're going to have to get a cryo bunk and go to sleep for a couple weeks. The actual science part of it is hand waved in this story. I really don't talk about that because I don't know how they did it. Just that we're in the future at some point, and humanity has figured out science-wise how to get to the stars. I wanted to have that there because what Zahanrael offers Ambrose is sort of a salvation, and the beginning of that salvation is the tearing apart of form and self and spirit as they travel. And perhaps it is kind of a comment on things, that the way Zahanrael travels is a divine and unknowable agnostic thing, where somehow he does it. And is it a science? We'll never know, maybe. But I wanted to convey that for the feel of it as much as the difference of it. I didn't want to create like a kind of a conflict between science and faith at all. Mm-hmm. Or that, this one can do it and this one can't. But it was more for the realization of the tearing away of like this form that we're locked into, where Ambrose is locked into a planet and in a biosuit and in a job and in an everyday depression.
And Carol said, to the point that we tend to view art through our own lenses, David, from your words, I imagined Ambrose to be female. So not everyone sees them as male. So
I am overjoyed to hear it. Thank you, Carol.
Andrew Dibble wants to know what inspired the Duquesne world on your website.
That comes from the Dungeons and Dragons mentioned before. It was a map that I had drawn on graph paper when I was a kid. And then I brought it into the digital world, and having it mapped out. The name, I don't remember where it came from. It's a name and it's stuck, and I'm not even certain it's a good name for the continent.
How old were you when you came up with the name?
Probably 12, 13.
Okay.
But then all the lands within the fantasy map have been updated over time. Like I had a lot of cities, and I kept populating them as I was telling stories, and decided, okay, the protagonist is moving here, so I got to put a town there. So I'm going to update the map. I'm going to change that name because I sort of named, there's a lot of towns that are named after friends a little bit. So some of those had to change, and some of those had to be moved to another part of the map so they don't get put in the book, or maybe they do appear in the book. But it's more like the countries and political states and cities within Duquesne get updated over time to fit within the stories.
So how many Duquesne novels?
One is
just one novel that you're working on, haven't finished yet.
There's a novella, which was done a few years ago, which is a very straightforward adventure type tale. And it didn't get published. I probably might self-publish that one once I find an artist. I have completed a novel. I often think that it won't be my first published novel. It's just my first finished one. And I think that because it taps into a lot of themes of adoption and fatherhood and sonhood, which is close to me. And the character goes through that. But at its core, it's very much a male point of view oriented Joseph Campbellian arc. So it's classical fantasy. And I don't know how many agents and markets are looking for that heavily. So I do intend to send it out. But it was at least something that I could put the end on and realize that, the book's done. I didn't expect that. And start going on to write the next book, which has a young woman as the protagonist, and try to figure out the intricacies of that. So far completed 2 largish works.
Okay. You said it was close to you. Were you adopted?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. My wife is adopted, and when we were young, we have a son that we had given up for adoption. So we have a large, beautiful circle of things, and both of us actually through Ancestry.com. And I think we're going to hear more stories about this as time goes on. We both have met our birth families as well. Wow. And been reunited with them. So that's been something we're endlessly grateful about.
So how does
and
being...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Which I imagine might come into play and maybe in future stories.
Probably, yeah. How does being a winner of the Writers of the Future contest help you as you look forward in your career?
Having come sort of on the heels of not getting much published and struggling through a lot of writing, of course, one loses a lot of confidence. But I think it helps cement at least I don't feel as valid putting myself down as much. Because I know it had to go through a number of very respectable barriers to get where it is.
Oh, well, yeah.
I greatly appreciate David Farland's help, because he and his assistant, Michaela Carter, edited and gave me a lot of wisdom to think about as it came into its final form.
Yeah, maybe I should, I never read his bio that I was going to. Where is that? Yeah, we are very fortunate because not only, he lives here in St. George. And so he has helped me as we opened up the bookstore. He's done several events. He's done several workshops, for free. And so I know wherever he goes, he teaches. That's how I met him, was at a writer's conference and teaching and stuff. Well, are there any other questions that you have? Any of you? If not, I think I want to thank you a great deal for your time and your answers, your insight. And remember, you can order this book as well as a few of David's. I will copy, let me do that right now. I will. Because can you see? Oh, they're not there. Huh. Okay, the links. Actually, what I'm going to do is when I send the link to the YouTube video recording of this, it will also be links for the purchases. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Carol. So I'll be providing those links again in a follow-up email. And it was a pleasure to talk with you. I wish we could have had David on the call. Somebody else is just, it's not David, but we're about to finish. So I want to say goodbye to all of you. Goodbye. It was good to meet you, David. And yeah, and stay safe and well, all of you, wherever you are.